Welcome to this virtual CRESS event. It's part of the Productivity During Pandemic series. I'm Dr. Michelle Dion, Associate Professor of Political Science and the Academic Director of CRESS, which is the Center for Research in Empirical Social Sciences at McMaster University. I want to begin by acknowledging that McMaster is on the unceded territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee peoples, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I am delighted to be able today to introduce Justin Esarey. He is an associate professor at Wake Forest University, and he is a specialist in political methodology with a particular interest in hypothesis testing in the scientific ecosystem. He's currently the Principal Investigator of the International Methods Colloquium project, which is an online seminar series that he's been doing for several years now, before even we were all in isolation, that usually throughout the academic year has sessions on Fridays at noon. So if you're interested in finding out the most up-to-date trends in political methodology, I suggest you join Dr. Esarey during those events. Today, he's going to be talking to us about a new project that he's been working on and the title of the talk is Truth and Consequences, How Scientists Think About Error and Fraud in Research. So thank you, Justin, for being with us.
Thank you, Michelle. And as I'm sure everyone will observe, Michelle's actually a co-author on this project, along with Daniel Bischof, who is currently at the University of Zurich, but I believe is starting as an assistant professor at University of Aarhus pretty soon, next year. And Carly Bolton, who is an undergraduate here at Wake Forest. Wake Forest spends a lot of time and money getting its students involved in research, and we were happy to be able to get Carly involved in this project. Basically, what I want to do is just, this is fairly preliminary work. We fielded a survey just a few months ago, and we're still drafting, so we hope that you will have some feedback for us. Because I think we can incorporate that into our project. Just to motivate what we're doing here today, it has been observed very often that corrections and retractions are quite rare in social science, but also in science generally. So this is something, for example, that the retraction watch people are always talking about. Brian Nosek and his team have talked about it. John Ioannidis has talked about it. But essentially, if you look at the number of corrections and retractions issued as a proportion of total publications, it's extremely rare. Less than 1% of publications are corrections or retractions. And there are several possible explanations for this. It could be because errors are very rare, right? It could be that we're all just really good at our job and or fastidious. And so there aren't that many things to correct. And so when you see big splashy cases like Brian Wansink, who had to retract most of his work because it had turned out to be manipulated and p-hacked and kind of misleading. That's because that fraud is basically what we're detecting, and fraud almost never happens. And so therefore we don't really see a lot of things we need to correct or retract. But another possibility is that people making honest errors fear the consequences of correcting those errors. So if, for example, when you think of corrections and retractions, you're thinking of Brian Wansink or Dietrich Stoppel, the guy who falsified a bunch of data a few years ago and essentially had to retract almost everything he'd written in the last 10 years. Or a little more recently and a little closer to home for us in North America, Michael, what's his last name, LaCour, who falsified data for a very prominent science study about, Science magazine study about contacting, the effect of being contacted or canvassed by a political worker. If you think of those cases, when you think of corrections and retractions, maybe you're afraid that to do it because all three of those people had their careers ended. Now, of course, that what they did is quite different than just correcting an error, right? An honest scientific error. But it could be that in people's minds, these things are conflated. The prominent examples we have are these sort of big fraud cases where people suffer terrible consequences, and so maybe we just don't go looking for things we don't want to find. Finally, another possible explanation is just that we don't agree that on what needs to be corrected or retracted. It could be that for lots of people just think, it doesn't matter, you can just leave it be, or maybe I'll just, mention it in my next paper, or post it to my website. There are all kinds of things people can do that don't involve asking a journal to correct and retract. I'll also say the other side of this is at the journal, many of them are not particularly interested in spending tons of their time and page limits issuing corrections. So it's not something that's going to get them a lot of attention or plaudits. So if they don't expect to have to be able to do it, if they don't want to do it, maybe they just don't do it. So what we're interested in this paper is trying to determine which of these explanations, or multiple of them, are motivating or causing the rarity of corrections and retractions in social science. And the answer is important because all three of these possibilities suggest very different things about what science is, how it works, and what we should maybe do to do things differently, if we need to do anything differently. So what we did was write up a survey on Qualtrics of 8,868 authors of work published during the year 2019 in 20 prominent journals. And I'm not going to read off all these journals because there's a big old list of them, but they cut across a swath of political science. You can see the big, the big pair here, AJPS and APSR. I believe we have an APSR editor with us. BJPS is in there too. I've published there, so it's an awesome journal. IO, I haven't published there, so I don't know about that. The Journal of the American Medical Association, right? So there's also medical journals in here. A lot of that work I referenced earlier, comes from medicine. Some statistics journals, and then some general science journals like Nature and Science. They're just huge journals that publish all kinds of stuff. We also have a couple of psychology journals in there, a couple of statistical journals in there, particularly statistical journals that tend to publish things applied work, social science, hard science that uses statistics. We fielded this survey between March and May of this year, which you may recall is when the pandemic was blowing up, which was amazing timing. It turned out that we actually didn't suffer too bad in our response rates. We sent out 2 reminders. We got 615 valid responses, which is about a 7% response rate, which is not terrible for an email survey. I don't have a really good sense of how the outbreak of the pandemic really affected that, because a lot of people were sitting on their hands, right? We were just at home figuring out what to do. I'm trying not to catch a disease. Among the medical people, though, some of them were really busy because they all of a sudden had to do a bunch of stuff related to the pandemic. But then again, a lot of those researchers are not doctors. They're just, scientists. And so they didn't necessarily have to do a bunch of stuff with the pandemic. So it's a little hard to say exactly how that made a difference. I don't think it made a huge difference, but that's when the survey was fielded. So just to give you a sense of who's in here, you saw that swath of journals. It's probably not surprising that we have a little bit of an overrepresentation of political scientists due to the fact that we sampled some very prominent political science journals, and also the authors on this study are political scientists, and therefore we may have garnered a little bit more of a sympathetic response from recipients. But we also have a really big group of people from biology, which also incorporates things like biophysics or biostatistics sometimes. Basically, if they identified as biology, or if they put in their other something that was very closely related to biology, they went in here. Here, medicine and biology, there is some overlap. Some things you could put in one category and the other, and they decided which discipline they were in. So it was the respondents who were deciding that. In the rest of the fields, we sort of have a relatively even representation, not doing too well on history or information sciences. Statistics, we have a 35 or so respondents. So because we don't have a representative group of, let's say, anthropologists, we group these into sort of larger subfields or superfields, I guess you would say. We classified all that big list of disciplines into humanities, medicine, social science, STEM, other, and then no response. And you can see that most of our respondents are coming either from STEM, and you can see their big spike of biology is a big part of that. But also, there's where's chemistry? Here's chemistry. You have a pretty big spike there as well. And social sciences, so political science, psychology, econ, stuff like that. We don't have really enough respondents in humanities, medicine, or other to draw any conclusions. So most of our analysis is either going to focus on the entire sample or just on these two subsets, where we have, somewhere between 200 and 300, actually a little more than 300 respondents, enough to draw some conclusions. In terms of the age of our respondents, I am in the middle. I am in the mode, about 35 to 44. Some younger people, and then a sort of a tail of older people, and even some retirees. And you can see that in, actually, let me skip forward a little bit, in what their job status is. So you can see the majority, or actually the mode, I guess I would say, the modal employment status was tenured. And also the modal placement was academic institution. So our modal respondent was a tenured professor, essentially, is what we're saying here, with a pretty good chunk of tenure track professors in here, obviously pretty active in research, and then a bunch of people who were some version of either teaching track or permanent employee, or fixed term finite contract. Not a lot of students, including graduate students, probably because the journals we selected were pretty high impact, pretty prominent journals. It's a pretty big thing to get a publication as a grad student in APSR. So probably not too many people have those. So we do have a little bit of an underrepresentation of the youngest people in the discipline, and you can see that in the age distribution as well. The 25 to 34 block, there's actually a block under here of 18 to 24, and we had no respondents in that block. So people starting graduate school essentially were not in here. But senior graduate students and assistant professors onward were. A few people in government, a few people in healthcare providers, nonprofits, things like that, but most of our respondents were professors or researchers. Okay, so going back to our research question, the first question is, maybe errors are just rare, right? And obviously we can't go and check thousands of publications for errors, but what we can do is ask our survey respondents how often they think several types of error occur in published work in their field based on their experience. And we have 4 levels of error. Minor errors that don't affect the main conclusions, substantial errors that impact some of the conclusions of the paper, major errors that impact the main conclusions of the paper, and fraud, which is fraud, right? It's not really actually an error, that's malfeasance, fraud or fabrication of evidence. So the first thing you see right off the bat is every dot here is a respondent. And what they're telling you is what percentage of the publications in their subfield do they think have these characteristics? And you can see, other than like 2 very skeptical people, most people think fraud is pretty rare. We're talking, the 75th percentile, less than 12.5%. Really, most of the action is in the 0 to 5% range, right? So not non-existent. We don't just have a line at 0. But people don't think that fraud is a significant problem in their discipline, at least based on how often they think it happens. On the other hand, all other types of error people think are pretty common. So major error, which recall the survey question here actually asks about errors that would change the fundamental conclusions of a paper. In the social sciences, somewhere between, let's say, 5 to 20% um, uh, uh, um, of publications have those sorts of errors according to the respondents in this study. And then, of course, there's a tail of people who think it happens much more often. People in STEM disciplines are a little more sanguine, but the distributions aren't terribly different. It's just that the density is concentrated a little more towards zero for the STEM people. But generally speaking, median error rates of, 8% for social sciences, maybe 5% for STEM is what people expect. Substantial errors that affect some of the conclusions. Now we're looking at medians closer to 20% for social science, closer to 12%, 13% for STEM. And then minor errors, at this point, people are saying half or more, right, of publications have errors that don't change the fundamental conclusions of the paper. That's a lot of papers, right? And minor errors, we could sort of maybe disagree about what should happen to them, which is one of the things we're going to talk about. But people think they happen all the time. But people also think that major errors are happening quite often. And there's no way we're seeing correction rates on the order of 5 to 10%. So 5 to 10% of papers are not corrected or retracted. So the first thing we know is errors, according to the respondents in our survey, errors do happen a lot, and they happen seriously enough that we might think about correcting them. They're not all just minor errors, and minor errors are ubiquitous. Minor errors are all over the place. What is their appropriate response to an error? So this is for STEM respondents. We ask them what somebody should do for an error that I want to say this is an error that affects some of the conclusions of the paper. I don't think this was the major error. I think this was the, oh no, we have all 4 categories. I'm sorry. We have minor errors, substantial errors, major errors, and fraud. Now, one thing you'll notice right off the bat is among social scientists and STEM people, they think fraud should be retracted. We're talking almost 100% of respondents are putting, actually exactly 100% in the social science bin. Among STEM people, it's like 99.9% of people think fraud should be retracted. But among other types of error, there is disagreement. So for major errors, about half think the paper should be retracted, and about half think you should submit a core addendum. This is among social scientists. Among STEM people, not quite as balanced. More people think it should be retracted, but the same basic breakdown. For substantial errors, now we've got a lot more heterogeneity. Most people think you should submit a core addendum in both STEM and social science. But there are plenty of people, 12% saying, describe it in a new work or post it to your website or whatever. So a lot more disagreement about what to do about a substantial error. And a minor error, nobody thinks it should be retracted, but there's a lot of different advice you're going to get on what you should do with a minor error, from nothing all the way up to submitting a core addendum, right, which is the blue here. And not a lot of difference between the STEM and social scientists, except the social scientists don't seem to be as enthusiastic about describing the error in a new published work. You basically get almost exactly the same response when you ask people what they think the field thinks. In other words, what do they think the people in their discipline think? Again, most people say fraud should be retracted, although it is less than 100% the way it was before for both social science and for STEM. For major errors, you see the same disagreement between retraction and correction, and then you see the same kind of basic confusion when it comes to minor errors and substantial errors, with most people saying substantial errors should be corrected. And most people think that the field would just want to ignore minor errors. You will notice that purple bar, the scientists should take no action, there's a big difference between what people think is appropriate and what people think the field think is appropriate. So they think that the field thinks it's more likely to just be okay to ignore it. But if you ask people what they think, they would say something a little more confused. But on the other 3 categories, a little more agreement, except that maybe fewer people think the field think a core addendum is necessary. We're talking, 60 2.5% or whatever, as opposed to closer to 75%. So there is a difference here between what people think should happen and what people think will happen, essentially, but not drastic disagreement. Finally, if you ask them, what do you think people should what should happen to people who have core agenda or retractions issued, this was due to error, not due to fraud. We asked them about how various things should change. How should their prestige change? Scrutiny and peer review, should it go up or down? Opportunities for new jobs, income, grants, opportunities in professional organizations, and ability to publish, and then employment security in your own current job. And what you can see is for errors, this is what people think is appropriate for themselves. The modal category is almost always no change, particularly when you get to some of the more serious issues like income, employment security, ability to publish, opportunity in professional organizations. Prestige, which is a pretty, it's very important, yet also a little bit ephemeral. People are a little more disagreeing on that, with some people actually saying you should get a small decrease, but then an almost equal number saying you should get a small increase in prestige from correcting errors. Almost nobody thinks you should get a small decrease or increase in income for correcting errors. Then if you ask them, what about fraud, right? Much different story. Almost everyone says large decrease in prestige, large decrease in ability to publish, large decrease in employment security, and so on. I don't know who these people are saying large increase for some of these categories. That seems a bit weird to me. You can see the scrutiny and peer review, that's reversed because increases are worse. So a lot of people saying large increase for scrutiny and peer review. Some people saying a large decrease, that might actually mean they just think they shouldn't even read the paper. Like if I get a paper and it's by a fraudster, I just throw it in the trash. I don't even bother scrutinizing it. So that's kind of interesting. What's the difference between their desires and their expectations? Well, if we look at loss of prestige, and this is for correcting or retracting error, you can see that the bulk of the density is actually on the side of expected consequences being more severe, which means that people think that what will happen is actually worse than what should happen. And therefore, they expect to basically be unfairly punished if they, in terms of losing prestige, if they retract an error or correct one. And if you look at the difference between desired and expected consequences, the mean differences on all of our metrics, the differences are always positive and they're always statistically significant, which means everyone expects to be punished at some level more harshly than they deserve, particularly with prestige, right? It's almost a point on that scale, which is I want to say it's a 5-point scale. Let me go back here. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a 7-point scale. Sorry, about a point on a 7-point scale in prestige too harshly. It's a lot smaller for some of these other things, like for example, income. People don't expect to lose their job, I guess, or get a pay cut due to income. But grants, it's half a point. New jobs, over half a point difference. So people expect to suffer consequences beyond what they think they deserve. But for fraud, that is actually reversed. People think that the people committing fraud will suffer consequences less severe than they deserve, right? This is on the other side of things, the normative judgment being more severe. This is for scrutiny during peer review. So in other words, how much do people think people should be scrutinized harder under peer review if they commit fraud? And here, again, all the differences are negative and highly statistically significant. So, for let's say income, people think you're going to get off too easy by half a point on that 7-point scale. And that's pretty uniform against professional org scrutiny grants. I recoded scrutiny so that a negative would mean harsher in this case, just so they all kind of look the same. Employment security, again, about half a point. Prestige in publishing is a little smaller, but again, about a third of a point and highly statistically significant. So this is preliminary work, but I think we can draw some conclusions based on this. We're not quite finished yet, but this is, I think, what we can say right now. People don't think fraud is that common, but they do think error is common in both STEM and social science. So it's not, we can't say we don't see corrections because they don't happen, because apparently we all know they do happen, according to our survey. Everyone pretty much agrees that frauds should be retracted. Fraudulent or fabricated evidence should be retracted if it's the basis for a publication. But on everything else, the response is much more divided. So for major errors, they're divided between retraction and just a correction. And then for minor errors, it's all over the place. People don't have any idea what to do. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, people expect to be punished too harshly for fixing their mistakes, and they expect to get off too easy for committing research misconduct, fraud, or fabrication of evidence. And that kind of suggests that the rarity of public correction is really more driven by incentives than it's driven by anything else. If you believe that people are sort of confused about how an error should be handled, and you think you're going to get lumped in with fraudsters and therefore punished too harshly, maybe you just don't do anything, right? Except for the most serious errors. So what we still have to do, just to wrap up, we have some characteristics of the respondents being measured, such as their personality characteristics on the Big Five. I can tell you that doesn't really affect much. I did some statistical analysis. There's not much going on there. We asked them about their risk aversion. I haven't looked at that quite yet, but I don't expect there to be much going on there either, but we'll see. And we also asked them about their ambition, sort of what they want to get out of a scientific career. That may be more of a factor. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to turn out to be, but we are also going to look at how that impacts people's expectations for the correction of error. All right, well, I'm at 25 minutes, so I think I'll wrap it up and see if anyone has any questions.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. It was exciting to see all these new results. Neil, Ryan, you have any questions you want to ask Professor Esarey? I'm curious. I thought it was one of the things I thought was interesting is how similar in many ways the pattern across STEM and the social sciences are, even though our ways of doing science are very different. You know, individual versus collective, you know, lab-based, where there tends to be more precision in measurements and methods than perhaps in some of the social sciences. Is that, you think, because we share the same incentive structure in terms of our, you know, tenure processes and hiring processes? Why do you think we're so similar? Or is it because we're similar types of humans?
I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer that question with our data because we don't ask, for example, about practices. However, I do think that it is probably misleading to say that the STEM practices are, on the whole, more airtight. They are different. For example, they're much more likely to have a hierarchical lab structure where people are sort of working under the direction of a PI, and the PI says, do this, do that. And then, you know, postdocs handle the day-to-day supervision of the actual scientific work. But there's the same sort of ambiguities, problems, hidden things pop up in STEM research as they do in social science research. And, you know, for example, when you look at the cases of fraud, yeah, there are some social science cases, but there are also cases where people modify, let's say, scanning electron micrographs of things to make them look a little better, to make them support the evidence a little more. In chemistry, there are cases where there are lots of irreproducible results, where people say, if you do this and that, this will happen, and it just doesn't happen. And these things do hopefully get weeded out over time, but they do occur, and they occur because, when you've got a ton of people all racing to publish as fast as they can, and without a huge amount of oversight, just, because in peer review, we don't usually replicate their work. Some of this stuff gets through. And most of it is probably honest error, right? Based on what we expect from the what we see here in the expectations of our survey respondents. It does suggest just setting a lab model up in the social sciences probably isn't going to fix things, because many of the STEM disciplines have that, and it didn't fix things.
Mm-hmm. But there perhaps is stronger socialization into these norms about what you should do, or you would expect that, but we don't actually see that.
Yeah, I mean, if you if you look at what people think is the appropriate response to an error, it's pretty much the same. A little bit, I would say the STEM people are perhaps a little more what do you call it, harsh. They think substantial error should almost always be corrected, as opposed to a little more disagreement among the social scientists. But it's not a qualitatively hugely different pattern. It's just the same pattern with a little more intensity in the case of STEM.
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in with a non-statistical question?
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious as to what the impetus was for even going into this question in the first place, because it does have, it could be an incredibly uncomfortable question for a lot of people that you're asking the question of. So what was the reason that you all decided to even go down this road in the first place, to even dig further into this question?
I just really like to antagonize all my colleagues. I had to issue a core agendum. We on a paper in comparative political studies, we had some results on joint testing of hypotheses. Once it was published, I was trying to apply it to another piece of work, and I realized there was a logical error in the way one of our tests was constructed. So it invalidated some of the results of the paper, but not all of them, and not what I would consider to be the core one. So we're in this category here, the substantial error. And you can see in the social sciences, there's a lot of disagreement about what you should do about that, right? There are people who say, oh, you should definitely correct it, right? But then there are also people who say, do nothing. And there are people who say, post a core agendum to your website. And so it was a little unclear what we should do. It was also unclear what would happen to us as a result of issuing the core agendum. On the one hand, I thought that we should do it because it's the right thing to do. On the other hand, I was the one who discovered my own error. Nobody else did, including our peer reviewers. It wasn't a data type error. It was actually an error you could catch in peer review. It just wasn't. I had also presented this work several times and it wasn't caught. And so I was thinking like, okay, well, what's going on here? This is weird, right? Like, how did it get through? This is not the sort of obscure thing that's going to pass by because no one's line checking your code. And that leads to another bunch of other questions, which is, well, what about all that code, right? Like what about all the stuff that's not being checked? And so I think my personal reason for getting involved in this was, first of all, just to figure out what was going on, like how people thought about this. And I'm hoping that putting this out there will enable us to think a little more clearly about this topic and a little less emotionally about it. And in particular, I really hope when we look at these differences in desired and expected consequences, I mean, what this data literally says is everyone individually thinks that something should happen, but they all also collectively think it won't. So it suggests that there's a pretty significant inefficiency or maybe even a conscious disparity in how people are talking versus how they actually think. And so if we can if this paper can move people to a better equilibrium where we are, our expectations and our desires are, as a field, scientifically, are more in line, I think that's a good thing. Yeah, I mean, I getting involved in science, the science of science, it's not a great way to make friends, to be perfectly honest with you, because a lot of people will say you're a scold, and then there are people who just seem to delight in, you know, bringing people down or saying they're wrong or whatever. If that happens, that's not what we're trying to do here, though. If anything, you know, going back to that earlier graph, we shouldn't feel bad about making errors because everyone knows they're going to happen. We should try to minimize them. We should think about institutions to make that number go down. But we, you know, if anything, I think this evidence leads against the gotcha sort of, let's bring down people who make mistakes. I remember poor Reinhardt and Rogoff, who, you know, couldn't make their Excel sheet work and came up with some bad conclusions and then were corrected. You know, that's exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about here, right? It's an honest error. It should have been caught, but it wasn't. Somebody did catch it eventually. You know, what actually happened to them and what should have happened to them, right? And probably what actually happened to them was more harsh than what should have happened.
That prompts me to kind of think or to wonder what you think, because you've thought about it probably more than any of us, about what you think as individual researchers we can do to minimize errors. And I'm really curious what you think editors in the peer review process could do differently. Like what, you know, I'm now one of the editors of one of these high profile journals, and, you know, I'm quite worried that we might accidentally publish something that has a significant error. So how have you thought about how the peer review process could be done differently to minimize publications with errors, or to uncover fraud if that's a concern?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is, based on this data, I can already tell you will publish a mistake, and it will be a major one.
And will it be found? That's the
unclear. And you shouldn't, you know, yes, you should try to fight that as much as possible, but you should just accept that now, because when you're studying things you don't know the answer to, you know, think about it this way. You know, when you're doing math homework, you don't get 100% every single time. And that's in a domain where you actually can know exactly the right answer. And in principle, everything, the things you're studying in school are solved, right? You're not pushing the frontiers. So it's not going to, you know, people are not going to do on average way, you know, perfect on every assignment, so to speak, in a field where you actually don't know the answers. What can we do about it? Well, you know, there's these things like the Odom Institute or other code auditing efforts that I think do help. I should say our code was audited by the journal that had published our paper, and they didn't catch the error either because it wasn't a code error. But I think actually more important than that, although that is important, is to be open to discussing the problems. And I know that journals don't want to spend pages on this, and I know why, and I understand it. But I think we've got to find some way to make that conversation possible and to reward people for having it. I don't necessarily want to create an ecosystem where takedown artists are lauded, but I do think that we want to create an ecosystem where honest error corrections are discussed and they're not humiliating for anyone, and the people doing them can get some career credit for it, right? They can put a line on their CV or something that's going to help them get tenure or promotion. Does that mean the APSR becomes the Journal of Corrections? I don't think so. I do think that it would be nice if there was some space for it. And it might be the case that we just need to have a specialized journal that's about this. And actually, I just as a lark on Twitter, I posted a poll one day like, oh, what do you think about, having a journal that's basically just about discussing errors or other kind of research issues. And the response was exactly divided, almost exactly 50-50, yes, no, and strong feelings on both sides. Which tells me there's something interesting going on here, and not a consensus. I can say it's very hard right now to get an error correction published, especially if you're not already famous. And so if that's the case, I wouldn't expect things to change because there's not going to be any career incentive. It's going to be more in your interest to make mistakes and then never talk about them than to either fix them or find them.
Yeah, I also, as you were describing that, I was thinking about qualitative research and how what some people might think, and I think this can happen in quantitative research as well, where people can think that they've found an error when really it's a difference of interpretation of a particular piece of evidence. Like I'm thinking about, there was one review of my book where the reviewer indicated that I had, 3 errors. And I went back to the manuscript and kind of followed the footnotes and the references, and I was kind of like, no, this is a difference of opinion, right? Like this is, I did not make a mistake in my citations, and I went back to the original sources and read them, and still they said what I said they said, so it wasn't, to my mind, a mistake. It was an issue of interpretation. And so I guess that can happen in quantitative research as well, but the more common would be an error where you kind of flipped a sign in the code, or you've done something backwards. But I guess I'm hearing you talk about this has prompted me to kind of wonder a little bit more about methodologies and the roles that different methodologies that we use in the social sciences are more or less likely prone to error versus differences of opinion and interpretation. Like my initial hypothesis is that, you're more likely to make a coding mistake in a quantitative research project than a similar type of mistake in a qualitative project. Whereas in a qualitative project, you might be more likely to have a difference of opinion and interpretation of what a result means, and that might be less common in quantitative work. I'm not sure I'm explaining that very clearly, but do you get do you have a sense of that, or have you thought a little bit about like what it means to make an error when you're using different types of methodologies, and how different methodological perspectives or approaches would shade the interpretation of an error or what counts as an error differently?
Yeah, I mean, the modal publication in a political methodology journal is something like, so-and-so did this analysis on this data that leads to these conclusions, but if you do this better methodology or better technique, you get these other conclusions. So canonical example, I use, some kind of model on the data, and I get these answers. I use a more sophisticated model, or a model that corrects for some possible issue, like I use a selection model instead of a straight OLS model. I get different answers. Is it a mistake, right? Well, so let's take actually a little bit of a finer example. So suppose I have some data, I analyze it using clustered standard errors. I get an answer and I report it. And then I realized, well, wait a minute. When the number of clusters is very small, you can see in simulations that the standard errors are way too small. And so my answers are all probably too not sufficiently conservative, right? They're probably too high of a type 1 error probability. Is that a mistake? I think you're going to get a lot of debate about that. You're going to get some people saying, look, you use one model, you got this, you use another model, you got that. It's all obvious in the paper. So if you don't like it, you'll know that, right? Other people will say, no, it's unambiguously an error, right? You used an inappropriate methodology. And then the really interesting one is, I didn't know that was the case when I was doing it, and now I do, right? And maybe nobody knew when I was doing it that this was wrong, and now I do. Is that an error? Is it an error if you could not have known? I think this is kind of the reason why you want a journal, and that's all hardcore. That's the hardest core quant there is, right? We're literally arguing about models. When you have those kind of situations, I think there's still going to be ambiguity, even in quantitative research where the precision is high enough that you can actually, in some cases, identify true unambiguous errors. There's still going to be lots of ambiguous cases. The problem is, in methods journals, we can only have that conversation if you have a new model that you want to promote or something. You can't just say this person did this thing in this paper and that doesn't make sense, right? That's not going to get published probably, unless the only exception being if it's a blockbuster paper and you really change things a lot. So it's not just qualitative work where you find those sort of more ambiguous cases. Are they errors? Well, in this paper, we sidestep that by just specifying that it's an error, right? I'm sure if you introduce another layer of ambiguity, you're going to get even more confusing answers.
And that answer actually prompts me to think that the short answer to Cheryl's question would have been because you're a methodologist. Because one way of thinking about the entire subfield of methodology, whether you're kind of a sociologist or a political scientist, is you're trying to reduce errors. You're trying to improve the methods we use to understand the world, whether you're using qualitative methods and innovating there or quantitative methods and innovating there. The kind of fundamental underlying goal of the field of methodology is to reduce errors in the ways that we understand the world or make sense of the world. And so in that sense, it's kind of natural that you would be interested in a project like this, given that, kind of the bigger field or subfield within political science in which you work is one that kind of has as its mantle, let's improve the way we do these things, right? And part of that is reducing errors. I'm going to pause now and see if there are any last questions, and if not, yeah, go ahead.
My question is pertaining to subconscious bias. So let's say you kind of discuss like a dialogue, maybe these two authors kind of go back and forth, but you kind of brought up in your specific case how you actually caught your own mistake and owned up to it, like, the true academic that you are. But do you think it's possible for people who write a journal article with a subconscious bias, knowing they're right about it, and then they catch their own mistake, and then they just don't own up to it, and then it's just never caught? Do you think it's something that would normally happen, or do you think academics have like a sense of like morality to like own up to their own mistake, even if they like don't agree with it?
Academics are probably pretty much like everyone else. You're going to have a small number of people who are psychopaths who just don't care what happens as long as they win. You're going to have a few people who are, Inspector Javert, who really care about the rules, but don't see the larger picture. You're going to have a lot of people confused about what they want to do the right thing, but it's hard to know what that is. And then you're going to have a lot of people who are just driven. They're mixing it all together, and they're being pushed around by their incentives and their peers. The thing is, first of all, I had tenure, and that does protect you, and it enables you to make this kind of make that kind of decision. But I won't say that it was easy for a lot of different reasons. In my case, in fact, so the error basically relates to the distinction between composite null hypotheses and separated null hypotheses. And I discovered later that another person in statistics was basically doing the same thing I was doing, but they essentially just said, well, I'm going to treat this as a composite null, a composite point null. And if you do that, the technique we talked about works fine. I would argue that composite null almost never exists. And so even in my case, I could have probably, weaseled my way out of it in some way. And I think the temptation to do that is pretty strong, because nobody likes to be wrong. And esteem is the currency of academia. And finally, I don't like to quote Feynman too much because he's kind of a jerk, but he did say the easiest person to fool is yourself. And so the hardest part of being a scientist is to be honest with yourself. And then once you can accomplish that, the rest is just ordinary honesty. But I've had minor errors that I posted to my website, and that's it, because I talked to my peers, and that's what they told me to do, and I said, okay, well, it makes sense. I've had a minor error that somebody reported to me. I sent it to the journal, and they didn't care. Like, they were like, this is not important. Okay, fine. I'll just put it on my website and move on. So it's not just morality that's going on here, right? It's also like people are not certain what to do about this. They're not certain how often it's happening. And so I don't think we can, we shouldn't build a system that relies on saints to work correctly.
Great, excellent. I like the final thoughts about what it means to be a scientist, or what we aspire to do as scientists. And thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Justin, for sharing this research with us. And our next CRESS productivity during pandemic talk will be Friday at 1 p.m. And then at that talk, we're going to have a research librarian from the research library talking about all the resources they've put together for the fall term for faculty and students doing research. So it should be helpful to help orient particularly new students to McMaster and what types of supports there are for research. So thanks again, Dr. Esarey, Justin, for being with us. I really enjoyed hearing about these preliminary results, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.
And thank you very much for having me.